On the morning of June 22, 1944, at 6:17 a.m., 31-year-old Raoul Wallenberg sat in his Stockholm office, staring at a telegram from Budapest. The message came from the Swedish legation, bearing three names that represented people he had personally known: Irene Mihaly, Ferenc Mihaly, and their daughter Eva. These were individuals he had shared dinner with 18 months earlier, and now they faced imminent deportation to Auschwitz within 3 weeks. Wallenberg was a Swedish businessman with no diplomatic experience and no official authority. His business partner's sister and her family were among 200,000 Budapest Jews marked for deportation. Within the next 72 hours, this civilian architect would volunteer for a mission that violated every principle of diplomatic neutrality. Driven by the memory of having shared a Sunday dinner at Irene's apartment in 1942 and his inability to abandon those people to their fate. The telegram and the decision. The telegram arrived at the Central European Trading Company offices. Koloman Lauer received it first, read it 3 times, and walked silently to Wallenberg's office, handing it to him without commentary. The message contained 3 brief sentences from the Swedish legation in Budapest, informing them that the German occupation was complete, Jewish deportations were beginning, and Lauer's relatives should register for Swedish protective documents immediately. Lauer's relatives included his sister Irene, her husband Ferenc, their 12-year-old daughter Eva, his wife's parents, and his brother-in-law. 6 people in total, all family members whom Wallenberg knew personally. He had met them in November 1942 during a 5-day visit to Budapest. Lauer had asked him to visit the family to ensure they were safe. At that time, Hungary remained protected as a German ally, and while Jews faced restrictions, they did not yet face extermination. Wallenberg recalled the Sunday dinner at Irene's apartment, where they had eaten chicken paprikash. Ferenc worked as an accountant, and Eva played piano. Their conversation had centered on the war, Hungary's prospects for remaining safe, and whether the family should attempt to leave. Irene had expressed that leaving was impossible. They had no visas, no international connections, and no money for bribes. They planned to remain in Budapest and hope for the best. Ferenc had asked Wallenberg for his opinion on whether Sweden might help Hungarian Jews if circumstances deteriorated. Wallenberg had responded that he did not know, explaining that Sweden maintained neutrality and stayed out of the war. After dinner, Eva had performed Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. She possessed genuine talent and took her music seriously, hoping to study at the Budapest Conservatory someday. Wallenberg had thought she was probably skilled enough to achieve that goal, provided the war did not destroy everything first. That memory had remained with him. The image of this 12-year-old girl playing Chopin in an apartment that might not exist in 2 years. The sound of music in a world that was systematically destroying everything beautiful. He remembered how Irene had looked at her daughter during that performance, with pride mixed with fear. She understood what was coming and knew that Hungary's protection was temporary, recognizing that Germany might eventually demand Hungary surrender its Jews. After dinner, Ferenc had walked Wallenberg to the door and asked once more whether Sweden would help if things became truly desperate. Wallenberg had given the diplomatic answer, the safe answer, stating that he did not know and could not make promises he could not keep. Now, 18 months later, he wished he had responded differently. Eva was now marked for deportation to Auschwitz along with her parents and Lauer's in-laws. The crisis unfolds. Koloman Lauer stood holding the telegram and stated plainly that they were going to kill his sister. Wallenberg understood this assessment was correct. Germany had occupied Hungary on March 19th, and Eichmann had arrived the same day with an explicit mission to empty Hungary of all 437,000 Jews, transport them to Auschwitz, gas them, and complete the operation before the Soviet army reached Budapest. Eichmann operated with ruthless efficiency. Deportations began in May at the rate of 12,000 Jews per day, every single day, with people packed into cattle cars. 91% were gassed immediately upon arrival. The numbers were staggering. Over 200,000 Hungarian Jews had already perished by June, most from the countryside. Now Eichmann was preparing to clear Budapest of its remaining 200,000 Jews, including Lauer's family. Lauer asked what could be done. Wallenberg acknowledged that he did not know. Sweden maintained diplomatic relations with Hungary and could issue protective documents to people with Swedish connections, but this might help only a few hundred people, not enough for everyone. Lauer responded that he did not care about everyone. He cared about his sister, his in-laws, and Eva, who played Chopin and wanted to study music. He asked whether Sweden could protect them specifically. Wallenberg indicated this might be possible. Sweden was issuing protective passports providing provisional Swedish citizenship for people with business or family ties. The Lauer family qualified because Ferenc had worked with the Central European Trading Company, establishing a Swedish business connection. Lauer insisted on obtaining the passports for them, whatever it required, including any necessary bribes. Wallenberg stated he would contact the Swedish Foreign Ministry, though he already understood what needed to be done. Someone needed to travel to Budapest, someone who could issue documents, negotiate with Eichmann's people, and remove Lauer's family and as many others as possible from the deportation lists. The mission takes shape. That same day, the U.S. War Refugee Board representative in Stockholm convened a meeting. The Americans understood that Eichmann was preparing to clear Budapest and wanted Sweden to send someone to organize a rescue operation. The first choice was Count Folke Bernadotte, Swedish Red Cross chairman and member of the royal family who possessed perfect diplomatic credentials. However, the Hungarians rejected him as too high profile and too obviously an intervention. Someone suggested Koloman Lauer, an expert on Hungary with business connections who knew the city and understood the situation. Lauer declined, explaining that as a Jew, he could not travel through Nazi-occupied territory. The Germans would arrest him at the border. Then Lauer made a suggestion that changed everything. Send Wallenberg. He knew Budapest, spoke German and Hungarian, had been there on business, and could move freely as a Swedish citizen. When asked about Wallenberg's diplomatic experience, Lauer acknowledged he had none, but argued he was intelligent, creative, and did not follow rules when those rules did not make sense. Exactly what this operation required. The committee expressed skepticism. Wallenberg was 31 years old, an architect and businessman with no diplomatic training and no experience in rescue operations. But they were desperate. Bernadotte had been rejected, time was running out, and Eichmann was deporting 12,000 people per day. By September, Budapest would be empty. The committee agreed to approach Wallenberg. Lauer visited him that afternoon, explained that the War Refugee Board wanted to send someone to Budapest, and asked if he would be willing to go. Wallenberg inquired about the mission's nature. Lauer explained it was to save as many Jews as possible, starting with his family, his sister, his in-laws, the people Wallenberg had met. Wallenberg looked at Lauer for a long moment, thinking about Irene making chicken paprikash, Eva playing Chopin, and Ferenc asking whether Sweden would help if things got worse. Wallenberg had said he did not know. Now he did know. Sweden would help, and he would help. Wallenberg agreed to go. His mother pleaded with him not to go. Budapest was a death trap, where the Germans controlled everything and the Soviet army was approaching. The city would become a battlefield where he could die. Wallenberg responded that Lauer's sister was already dying there, her daughter was dying there, and someone had to try to stop it. His business partner argued this was insane. He was a civilian with no authority and no protection. The Germans could arrest him, and the Hungarians could shoot him. Wallenberg acknowledged this was possible, but stated that doing nothing meant watching Lauer's family get loaded onto cattle cars. He preferred to take the risk. Securing authority and arriving in Budapest. On July 6th, Wallenberg went to the Swedish Foreign Ministry and demanded full diplomatic authority. He wanted the right to issue protective documents without clearing them with the ambassador first, access to War Refugee Board funding for bribes and operations, and freedom to use any methods necessary. The ministry was shocked. Junior diplomats did not make such demands. However, the War Refugee Board had specifically requested Wallenberg. American funding was contingent on his appointment, and the situation in Budapest was desperate enough that unconventional methods might be necessary. The ministry agreed, granting him the diplomatic title of First Secretary of the Swedish Legation, full authority to issue protective documents, access to War Refugee Board funds, and permission to operate independently. Wallenberg packed his bags and left Stockholm on July 6th, traveling by train through Denmark, Germany, and Austria, crossing into Hungary on July 9th. He carried 2 suitcases, one with clothes, one with blank papers, rubber stamps, Swedish flags, and a list of names. At the top of that list were Irene Mihaly, Ferenc Mihaly, Eva Mihaly, and the Lauer-Stein relatives, 6 people he intended to save first, then everyone else he could reach. Wallenberg arrived in Budapest on July 9th at 2:22 p.m. and went straight to the Swedish legation to meet with Ambassador Ivan Danielsson. Danielsson provided a briefing indicating the situation was worse than the telegram suggested. Eichmann had already deported over 298,000 Hungarian Jews. The deportations had only paused in early July because Admiral Horthy had bowed to international pressure, but everyone knew the pause was temporary. The Arrow-Cross Party, Hungarian fascists, who hated Jews even more than the Germans, was growing stronger. When they took power, deportations would resume, and Budapest's 200,000 Jews would be targeted. Wallenberg asked about protective passports, and learned that approximately 700 had been issued, all to people with legitimate Swedish connections. 700 people protected out of 200,000 at risk. Wallenberg requested the list of people who had already received passports and checked for Lauer's family. They were not on it. He informed Danielsson that he needed to issue passports to 6 specific people immediately, listed the names, and explained their connection to the Central European Trading Company. Danielsson authorized it, and 6 passports were prepared that day. The first rescue. Wallenberg's first priority was delivering those 6 passports. He had addresses from Lauer's notes. Irene and Ferenc lived on Pozzoni Street in a designated Yellow Star house, buildings where Jews were concentrated. Arrow-Cross militias patrolled these areas constantly, raiding apartments and dragging people into the streets. Wallenberg drove there on July 11th. The building bore a large yellow Star of David. Guards at the entrance checked documents. Wallenberg showed his Swedish diplomatic identification and stated he was delivering official documents. The guards allowed him through. He climbed to the 3rd floor and knocked on apartment 3B. Irene answered, looking older than he remembered, exhausted and frightened. The apartment behind her was crowded with multiple families sharing the space, children sleeping on the floor, and the overwhelming smell of too many people in too small a space. She did not recognize him at first, seeing only another official at the door, another person who might be there to take them away. Then recognition dawned and she spoke his name. Her voice broke as she said it, and she grabbed the doorframe to steady herself. Wallenberg handed her 3 passports, protective Swedish documents for her, Ferenc, and Eva. She took them with shaking hands, examining the official stamps, the Swedish seals, and the photographs that Lauer must have sent from Stockholm. She began crying and asked how this was possible, how Coleman had managed this, and whether it was real. Wallenberg explained that Coleman had sent him, and that Sweden was protecting people with business connections. The Mihaly family qualified. Ferenc came to the door and looked at the passports and asked if they were genuine. Wallenberg confirmed they were officially issued by the Swedish legation and that German authorities would recognize them. Ferenc asked what they should do. Wallenberg instructed them to keep the passports with them at all times. If Aerocross militias came, they should show the documents and state they were under Swedish protection. He acknowledged it might not work, but it was their best chance. Eva appeared behind her father, 13 years old now, having grown since Wallenberg last saw her. She asked if Wallenberg had come to take them to Sweden. He explained, not yet, but perhaps soon. The passports meant they were registered for repatriation, and when the situation stabilized, they could leave Hungary. Eva asked if she could still study music in Sweden. Wallenberg confirmed that Stockholm had an excellent conservatory where she could study. She smiled, the first smile Wallenberg had seen on any face in Budapest. Wallenberg then made an additional request. He needed their help. Thousands of other families existed like theirs. People in yellow star houses waiting for deportations who also needed Swedish documents. He asked if Irene could help identify people and spread word that protective passports were available. Irene agreed immediately, stating she would do whatever he needed. Expanding the rescue operation. Over the next 3 days, Wallenberg delivered protective passports to Lauer's in-laws and established a system where Irene and others would identify people who needed documents. By July 15th, he had issued 200 passports. By July 20th, 500. By August 1st, over 2,000. He was printing them faster than anyone could count, no longer checking for Swedish connections, but simply handing them out to anyone who came to the legation. However, documents alone proved insufficient. Aerocross militias did not always respect papers. They would raid yellow star houses at night, shoot people in the streets, and throw bodies into the Danube. Wallenberg needed physical protection, buildings where people could hide under Swedish diplomatic immunity. He began renting apartment buildings in July, claiming they were extensions of Swedish diplomatic property. He placed giant Swedish flags on the roofs and posted signs declaring these buildings were under Swedish protection. This was completely illegal. Diplomatic immunity did not extend to random apartment buildings. However, Wallenberg gambled that Hungarian officials would not know the exact boundaries of diplomatic law. He was correct. The buildings marked with Swedish flags were mostly left alone. Aerocross militias raided every other building in the Jewish quarter, but hesitated at the Swedish houses. By September, Wallenberg had established 32 safe houses across Budapest, sheltering over 15,000 people, including Lauer's family. Irene, Ferenc, and Eva moved into a Swedish house on Stettin Street in August. They had one room shared with another family, but they were alive, protected, and safe for the moment. Wallenberg visited them every few days to check if they needed anything, food, medicine, or documents. Eva was teaching piano to other children in the building, giving lessons in the hallway, featuring Chopin, Liszt, and Bach. Music in the middle of genocide. She would gather 6 or 7 children every afternoon, sit them on the floor, and teach them simple pieces. They had no piano in the building, so she would hum the melodies and show them the finger positions on a table edge. The children loved her. She demonstrated patience and never showed frustration when they made mistakes, simply showing them again and making them believe music still mattered, even though their world was ending. Wallenberg observed one of these lessons in early September. Eva was teaching a 7-year-old boy a simple Chopin prelude. The boy's hands were shaking because he was terrified. His parents had been taken 3 days earlier. Eva held his hand steady, showed him the rhythm, and made him focus on the music instead of the fear. After the lesson, Wallenberg asked Eva why she was teaching. She explained that music was the only thing that made sense anymore. Everything else was chaos, random death, and arbitrary violence. But music had rules, structure, and beauty. If she stopped teaching, she would have nothing but fear. Teaching meant there was still a future, and still a reason to stay alive. Irene was helping Wallenberg's office, processing applications for protective passports and organizing food distribution. She had become part of the rescue operation. Ferenc worked as a translator. His German was fluent, enabling him to communicate with German officials and help Wallenberg negotiate. The family Wallenberg had come to save was now helping him save others. The Aerocross takeover. On October 15th, everything changed. The Aerocross party staged a coup, overthrew Admiral Horthy, and took control of the Hungarian government. The new regime immediately resumed deportations, but this time it was not organized trains, it was terror. Aerocross militias raided Jewish buildings every night, dragged people into the streets, shot them, and threw them into the Danube. Random executions and systematic murder became routine. Even Swedish houses were no longer safe. The Aerocross did not care about diplomatic immunity. They were fanatics and true believers who wanted every Jew in Budapest dead. On November 8th, Eichmann organized death marches, ordering 70,000 Jews to walk to Austria with no food, no water, and in sub-zero temperatures. Most would die on the road. On November 6th, Aerocross militias raided every building, including Swedish houses. The raid on Zent Istvan Street occurred at 3:47 a.m. 20 Aerocross militiamen, armed with rifles, smashed through the door, disregarding the Swedish flag flying above. They dragged everyone outside, men, women, and children, lined them up in the street, and began marching them toward the deportation assembly point. Ferenc attempted to show his Swedish passport. The militia commander ripped it from his hands, tore it in half, threw the pieces on the ground, and declared that Swedish documents meant nothing. Hungary was sovereign. The Aerocross controlled Budapest, and foreign powers had no authority there. Irene grabbed Eva, trying to shield her. A militiaman shoved her forward and told her to march or die. The Death March Rescue. Wallenberg received word about the raid at 6:23 a.m. One of his staff members had escaped, ran to the Swedish legation, and reported that the Zent Istvan Street house had been emptied. Wallenberg immediately thought of Lauer's family, Irene, Ferenc, and Eva. They had been in that building. He grabbed his car keys and told his driver, Vilmos Longfelder, that they were going to find the march column. Longfelder warned that this was suicidal. The Aerocross was shooting anyone who interfered with deportations and would kill Wallenberg without hesitation. Wallenberg stated that Lauer's family was in that column, and he was going to find them. They drove west out of Budapest, following the route the death marches used. The roads were crowded with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, and artillery fire could be heard in the distance. They found the first march column at 9:15 a.m., approximately 3,000 people walking slowly, guarded by Aerocross militiamen. People were collapsing on the road. The guards would kick them and force them to stand. If they could not walk anymore, they were shot and left in the ditch. Wallenberg stopped the car, exited, and began walking along the column, looking for faces he recognized and calling names: Irene, Ferenc, Eva. People looked at him confused and desperate. Some reached out, begging for help, for water, for food, for anything. An Aerocross guard told him to leave, stating this was a military deportation and civilians were not allowed. Wallenberg showed his Swedish diplomatic papers and stated he was looking for Swedish nationals who had been illegally detained. The guard insisted there were no Swedish nationals there, only Jews being deported. Wallenberg began handing out protective passports anyway, walking along the column, giving papers to people and telling them to show these to the guards. Maybe 50 people, perhaps more, anyone who looked like they might survive long enough to use the documents. But Lauer's family was not in that group. They were in a different column, further down the road. Wallenberg followed the marches, stopped at every checkpoint, handed out passports, and demanded releases. He found them on November 9th, 20 miles outside Budapest, in the second major column, 5,000 people, exhausted and freezing. Many had already died on the road, their bodies left where they fell, with the column simply marching around them. Wallenberg walked along the line looking for faces he recognized, handing out protective passports through the crowd, calling their names: Irene, Ferenc, Eva. Then he saw her, Eva, 13 years old, barefoot, freezing, and terrified. She was limping badly, and every step looked agonizing. Her feet were bleeding. She had been walking for 3 days without shoes in below-freezing temperatures. The road was partially frozen, with sharp ice cutting into her soles. Irene was behind her, supporting her and trying to keep her moving. Her own feet were wrapped in rags. She had given her shoes to Eva on the first day, but Eva had lost them when someone stole them while she slept. Ferenc was carrying a younger child whose parents had collapsed, a boy perhaps 8 years old. Ferenc's own strength was failing, but he would not put the boy down. Wallenberg pushed through the crowd and reached them. Irene saw him first. Her face went through shock, disbelief, then relief. She began crying, completely broke down and collapsed against him. She had thought they were all going to die, that nobody was coming, that Sweden had forgotten them. Eva looked at him but did not say anything, simply stared. She was beyond exhaustion, beyond hope, moving on pure survival instinct. Wallenberg pulled Eva out of the line first. She could not walk, so he had to carry her. She weighed almost nothing, 13 years old and starving. He showed her Swedish passport to the guards and stated she was a Swedish national under diplomatic protection. The guard laughed and declared that the passports didn't matter anymore. Aerocross orders superseded everything, and these people were being deported, all of them, with no exceptions. Wallenberg responded that the guard could then explain to Berlin why he defied Swedish diplomatic documents. Germany still needed Sweden for banking and iron ore, as Sweden was processing payments for German companies and handling diplomatic communications. Creating diplomatic incidents was not wise, especially not 3 weeks before the Soviets arrived. The guard hesitated, looking at Eva, at Wallenberg, and at the crowds of people watching this confrontation. Wallenberg did not wait for permission. He took Eva, Irene, and Ferenc and pulled them out of the column. He placed them in his car, all 3 of them, plus the young boy Ferenc had been carrying. He wrapped them in blankets and gave them water. They drank too quickly, forcing Wallenberg to slow them down, as too much water too quickly would make them sick. Eva could not stop shaking. Hypothermia was setting in. Her lips were blue, her skin was gray, and she kept trying to speak but could not form words. Wallenberg drove them back to Budapest, racing through checkpoints, showing his diplomatic papers and getting them through. He took them to a different Swedish house, one the Aerocross hadn't raided yet, a building on Ulloy Street, smaller than Zent Istvan Street, but safer. He got Eva to a doctor immediately, Dr. Laszlo Benedict, who had been working with Wallenberg's operation for months, treating people from the safe houses. Benedict examined Eva's feet and found the frostbite was severe. 3 toes on her left foot were black, with tissue already dying. He would have to amputate or risk losing the entire foot to infection. He asked for permission. Irene agreed to whatever was necessary to save her daughter's life. The surgery happened that night, with no anesthesia, only morphine they had stolen from a German medical depot. Eva screamed, and Irene had to hold her down. Ferenc stood outside, unable to watch. The doctor saved the foot. 3 toes were lost, but Eva would walk again, and would survive. Irene collapsed afterward, simply fell to the floor crying, not from grief, but from relief, from the realization that they were alive, that Wallenberg had come, and that Sweden had not forgotten them. Ferenc held Eva and would not let go, repeatedly thanking Wallenberg in Hungarian, in German, and in broken Swedish. Wallenberg stayed with them for 3 hours, ensuring they had food, medicine, clean bandages for Eva's foot, and shelter that was actually secure. Then he returned to the march routes, because thousands of others were still walking, still dying, and still needing rescue. Eva was the 47th person Wallenberg had pulled from the death marches that week. She would not be the last. Continuing operations. Over the next 6 weeks, Wallenberg operated constantly, rescuing people from marches, from execution sites, and from deportation centers. On November 28th, he stopped a mass execution on the Danube embankment. Arrow Cross militias had lined up 200 Jews and were shooting them and pushing bodies into the river. The executions had been ongoing for an hour, with perhaps 50 people already dead. Wallenberg drove his car directly between the executioners and the remaining victims, jumped out, and began handing out protective passports to people who were seconds away from being shot. The Arrow Cross commander raised his pistol, pointed it at Wallenberg's head, and told him to leave or die with the Jews. Wallenberg stated that the commander should shoot him then, but warned he would be hanged as a war criminal when the Soviets arrived. They were 10 miles away, and the commander would be executed for murdering a foreign diplomat. The commander hesitated, lowered his gun, and walked away. Wallenberg pulled 70 people away from that execution site. By December, Budapest was surrounded. Soviet artillery was constant. Buildings were burning, people were starving, and Wallenberg was still operating his safe houses, still issuing passports, and still appearing at execution sites. Liberation and disappearance. The Soviet army entered Budapest on January 13, 1945, ending the Nazi occupation and liberating the city. Over 100,000 Hungarian Jews had survived, with approximately 20,000 to 100,000 surviving because of Wallenberg's direct interventions. Lauer's family survived, all 6 of them: Irene, Ferenc, Eva, and the Lauer-Stein relatives. Eva played Chopin at a small concert in February 1945, the first music performance in liberated Budapest. She was 14 years old, missing 3 toes from frostbite, and alive because Wallenberg had pulled her from a death march. On January 17, 1945, Soviet military police arrested Wallenberg, stating he was being taken to Soviet headquarters for protection. He was never seen again. Soviet authorities claimed he died in prison in 1947, though some witnesses reported he was alive in gulags in the 1960s. The truth was never confirmed. The man who saved tens of thousands of Jews disappeared into the Soviet prison system because Soviet intelligence suspected he was an American spy. Legacy. Koloman Lauer spent the rest of his life trying to find Wallenberg, writing letters to Soviet officials and contacting diplomats, but never receiving answers. However, Lauer's sister survived, his in-laws survived, and his niece Eva survived and became a pianist. She studied in Stockholm as Wallenberg had promised, performed professionally, and lived until 2003. Eva gave interviews in the 1990s explaining that Wallenberg saved her life twice, once with a protective passport, and once by pulling her from a death march. She remembered him driving her back to Budapest, giving her his coat because she was freezing, and telling her she would study music someday, that the war would end and life would continue. She had thought he was lying, that there was no future, but he had been right. The war ended, life continued, and she studied music, became a pianist, and had children and grandchildren, all because Wallenberg could not let his business partner's family die. After the war, survivors told Wallenberg's story. People came forward stating that this Swedish diplomat had saved them, had pulled them off deportation trains, had sheltered them, and had stood between them and Arrow Cross executioners. The protective passes survived, thousands of them, providing physical proof that a businessman had designed documents impressive enough to influence Nazi officials. Israel established Yad Vashem in 1953 to honor non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews. Raoul Wallenberg was among the first honored, with his name appearing on the Avenue of the Righteous. The United States Congress made him an honorary citizen in 1981, only the second person ever after Winston Churchill. Sweden issued stamps, named streets, and built memorials. However, Wallenberg never knew any of this. He disappeared into a Soviet prison in 1945 and died unknown and unrewarded. Eva Mihaly played Chopin at his memorial service in Stockholm in 1981. She was 50 years old, a professional pianist, mother of 3, and grandmother of 5. All alive because Wallenberg had eaten dinner at her mother's apartment in 1942 and could not let that family die.